Hi, thanks for joining us for a Facebook Live event on the path for PFAS-free fighting gear with experts Sean Mitchell and Jeff Kanabi. My name is Scott Faber, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. We have two great experts to share their insights with you today. First will be Sean Mitchell, who's a 16-year veteran of the fire service. Sean's originally from Worcester and now resides on the island of Nantucket. And after we hear from Sean, we'll hear from Jeff Kanabi. Jeff was a reserve firefighter with the Alameda County Fire Department for 20 years, from 1998 to 2019. He's also worked in the PPE care and maintenance business of firefighting turnouts for the past 10 years. Jeff is also currently a PPE specialist with a fire department in Northern California and has been a tireless advocate for protecting our firefighters from PFAS contamination in their gear. We'll hear first from Sean and then from Jeff, and then we'd like to hear from you. We'd like you to take your questions. If you have a question, just add them to the comment bar on your Facebook page and we'll get to them after our presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Sean Mitchell.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for inviting me on today. I appreciate you allowing me to be here. So our story really began about 3 years ago. Sometime in 2017, we received a random Facebook message from someone named Diane Cotter. And so Diane was telling us that our turnout gear contained a toxic chemical called PFOA. So at the time, I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know what PFOA was or what PFAS were. But she seemed to be pretty knowledgeable and she was passionate. So we reached out to the people who sell us the gear. And we were happy to hear back that our gear, our PPE, was in fact safe. We were told that this chemical had been phased out and was only found in legacy gear. So there was nothing to worry about. So we didn't worry and we didn't change the way we operate. We didn't handle our gear any differently. We continued to wear it into schools, to shovel snow, and in many other instances outside of just emergency fire response. Nobody ever suggested that firefighters like us should train on how to actually handle our gear, or that we should minimize our exposure to it, or that even supposedly clean gear that had been washed may still present an exposure risk. They just said there was nothing to worry about. So nothing changed until early this year in January 2020. A group of firefighters met to discuss some health and safety issues. We spoke about many things, including AFFF. And one of the members of that team who met is Captain Nate Barber. And Nate was out of work at the time of that meeting because he was recovering from testicular cancer. And so he was telling us about AFFF and PFOA and all that he had learned about the exposures from it. And then the conversation turned to our turnout gear and the fact that we had been made aware in the past that there may have been PFOA in our legacy turnout gear. So again, we reached out to textile and gear manufacturers for more information. We were sent about a half dozen letters and documents which vaguely admitted that PFOA had been used somewhere in the process of making our turnout gear, and that the use of PFOA had been phased out around 2014 or 2015. And they said that PFOA was replaced with chemicals that were deemed harmless and completely safe for firefighters. So it turned out that when we were told in 2017 it was only in legacy turnout gear, the word legacy actually only meant about 2 years because it had been phased out only about 2 years prior. So we decided that given the unknowns about PFAS chemicals in general, we would submit a letter to our chief and our town administration requesting that they replace all of our turnout gear manufactured prior to 2016 because it seemed that the newer gear was not toxic. So we were happy to hear back very quickly that the town had agreed to our proposal and that they were going to make some funding available for the replacement of our turnout gear. The town recognized that this was a health and safety issue or a potential health and safety issue, and as did we. So at that point, I had to figure out what to do next. So I started to research everything I could find out about turnout gear and PFAS, not just PFOA, but all PFAS chemicals. And it turned out to be more challenging than I ever could have imagined. So over about the last 6 months, I've spoken with representatives from almost every textile and gear manufacturer. Some of those conversations have been helpful, while others have not. The companies I've spoken to can be placed into two categories: those who are unwilling to change and those who are unable to change. The unable claim that they could provide us with safe alternatives that contain no PFAS chemicals, but those textiles are unable to pass the NFPA certification process, making them unable to be sold. The unwilling believe that PFAS chemicals are not all bad and that they happen to be using the good ones. When pressed further for information, they explain that PFOA, also known as C8, had been replaced by C6, which is just another PFAS chemical, but they say it's been well studied and is extremely safe. When I ask for data that supports these claims, they cite studies that all have one thing in common. They've either been funded by chemical companies or they've been actually conducted by employees of DuPont, Chemours, and other associated chemical companies. There are some who admit that there may be an environmental impact years down the road, but they continue to state that there is no risk to firefighters. They choose to base these claims on studies done by the very people who make and benefit from the sale of these chemicals. C6 is what many scientists call a regrettable substitution. They've replaced one harmful chemical with another. And so during this time that I was doing this research, about a month ago, I responded to a fire, and I spent about 3 hours in turnout gear that was manufactured in 2009 because my newer set was being washed. So that gear was certainly made using PFOA. Later that day, I spoke with someone from a company who manufactured one of the layers of that gear that I was wearing earlier that day. And instead of explaining why PFOA was phased out or how I should handle the gear, I was sent a document claiming that PFOA exposure was considered insignificant and there was no risk in being exposed to it. So I researched that document and found out that it was based on a study conducted by employees from DuPont and Chemours. And the lead author of that study is a defense expert who has testified on behalf of DuPont in numerous lawsuits. So I did not, and I do not consider that to be unbiased research. I had a recent call with someone from the industry, and the first question they asked was, what are you going to say on Wednesday? Meaning, what would I say today in this conversation? And as the conversation ended, they said, don't make us look bad. And I know that some of the industry, including those people that I spoke to recently, mean no harm, and they're just passing along this information that they're given from above. But we need them to stop doing that. We need them to start researching the things that they're telling us. And if there's no unbiased science to support their claims, then it shouldn't be said. I don't want to continue to be told that they don't think there is a risk because they have no idea if there is or there isn't. And this is the most upsetting part, because history is clearly repeating itself right before our eyes, and it's recent history. First, they said PFOA was safe. Then they said Gen X was safe, and we know both of those are not. Now they say that C6 is safe, and we've yet to see any unbiased proof. How can they be sure there's no risk to firefighters from these chemicals that are contaminating entire communities around the world? Look in the past at Parkersburg, West Virginia, or recently at Cape Fear, North Carolina. They claim that these chemicals are safe, but they're filling our sinks with toxic chemicals. So at the moment, we're hopeful that there are at least 2 manufacturers working toward creating a PFAS-free outer shell for our turnout gear. The companies who produce the moisture barriers say they're unable to pass the strict certification requirements of the NFPA with anything other than a moisture barrier that's made with Teflon. For now, we're continuing to research, and since I'm here, I'd like to let firefighters know that when we hear of the subject of PFAS exposure from our turnout gear, we cannot simply ask the manufacturers or the suppliers for information, because that information is often biased, it's misleading, and it's confusing, and it doesn't explain the entire story. So we need to start asking difficult questions, see if they have the answers, and then we need to research their answers and find out for ourselves where the truth lies. I've been told 3 separate times that as we consider using PFAS-free PPE, we have to be careful not to make a decision based on emotion. And they're partially right. There is a lot of emotion behind this, but I think that's a good thing because it's the emotion that is driving people like us to demand answers and honesty. I'm in a small town on a small fire department, and I can name about 10 firefighters, both active and retired, who are sick. And the illnesses are all the same ones that have been linked to PFAS exposure. I have 2 young boys, Thomas and Patrick, and I want to be around for them. And I don't want to get sick because of an unnecessary exposure to PFAS chemicals. So there's a reason to be emotional, and there's a reason to fight for change. I'm confident that we're moving forward in the right direction, and we're hopeful that other fire departments are going to join and demand honesty from the industry. We want to know what's in our gear. We want to know in what amount and what the alternatives might be. There are some who say the industry needs to police themselves, but the firefighters are the ones who need to police the industry. As of today, we have no alternatives to heavily fluorinated gear. And I know this is just one source of exposure in a long list that firefighters face every day. But I believe this is an unnecessary one, and it's something that we can and should change.
Thank you, Sean. Next, we'll hear from Jeff Kanabe. Before we turn to Jeff, I just want to remind folks that if you have questions for Sean or Jeff, just put them in the comments bar, and we'll get to them after we hear from Jeff. Jeff, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Scott. That was some pretty compelling statements from Sean, and it is very unfortunate that members of the fire service are having to do such in-depth research, and I commend Sean for doing that. A lot of the times, firefighters just believe what the manufacturer tells them because they are the experts. They don't necessarily have or are provided the correct information from the upper echelons of where they're getting their information from. So great job, Sean. So what I'd like to kind of review now is what are some of the possible links to PFAS exposure. Now, whether this is through an AFFF, from a firefighter got exposed to it on their turnouts or on their bodies, or it's contaminated their drinking source, either their wells or their city water supply, or a occupational exposure on fabrics of firefighting gear that contain a fluorinated finish. Some of those ailments are increased cholesterol levels, a decreased vaccine response in children, increased risk of high blood pressure and preeclampsia in pregnant women, increased risk of kidney or testicular cancer. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation, but right now, the #1 cancer in the fire service is, for men, is testicular cancer. Now, is that a possible long-term workplace exposure to PFAS, or is it a combination of PHAs from fireground contaminants and the PFAS exposures? We don't know, but studies do have to be done. So next question is what can firefighters do to protect themselves from the long-term continued exposure over 10, 15, 20, or even 35 years of wearing gear? The one thing you need to ask yourself is, you do the risk-benefit analysis. Do I need to wear turnouts on this EMS call? There's no risk of thermal exposure. So do I want to knowingly continue to expose my skin and my body to a chemical that is proven that's in the gear that was used up until 2014, 2015, continually expose myself with that product? So that's the first question you have to ask. If you're not concerned with it, then unfortunately you're going to continue to wear it. But if you don't need to wear the gear, wear it. Now, some people in the industry are saying that, our committee is telling firefighters not to wear PPE. That is not true. That's their way of trying to discredit what we're saying. There is no alternative right now, as Sean said, there's no alternative to a PFAS-free structural firefighting PPE. So if you need to wear it, please wear it. It's there for your safety, and it works. Safe handling practices, as Sean said. A study that Professor Graham Peasley is doing over at Notre Dame University. They tested, did the finish come off with just Scotch tape? They had a clean piece of tape, they tested it, there's no fluorine on it, they stuck it to the gear, they pulled it off, now there's fluorine on it. It comes off. So now his students over there wear gloves, wear medical gloves, and handling the gear at all times, right? They don't touch it with their bare hands anymore. Now let me ask you the last time that you moved your gear, whether it be from your PPE locker room or your personal vehicle or wherever, and touched that gear and always had medical gloves on. More than likely not. And then if you did touch it, did you go and wash your hands right away? Maybe, maybe not. Then what you get to is if you've touched the gear or you're using your gear at public education events and you're bringing it to schools and you're letting the kids, the second, third, or fifth graders wear your gear, you're getting those possible secondhand exposures, not only to the possible carcinogens around the gear from fires if it's not completely clean, but now the PFAS exposure, potential exposure, and health risks that are associated with that. So you just want to be cognizant of that, and you probably don't want to have firefighting gear in schools or available for kids to try on anymore until more studies are done or there's a fluorine-free finish on these gear. So what can you do? Again, wear your gloves. Do you actually need to wear it? If not, then don't. When you're transporting this gear in your personal vehicle, whether you're working an overtime shift or you're a volunteer, just don't throw your stuff in the inside back seat or in the trunk, because that finish over time through UV degradation, chemical or high heat and fires does come off. And there are studies that are out there and more studies are going to come that proves that finish does degrade and it falls off and it attaches to the dust. That dust gets kicked up in your car or in your trunk. And then you have what the industry is called as inadvertent ingestion of the dust, which contains PFAS. Now, one exposure, depending upon how heavy or light it is probably not going to be a big deal. But continued long-term exposure to those dusts, whether it's in your vehicle, your trunk, your PPE room where you store all your gear, the apparatus, when you get there in the morning time, you open up the door, you throw your boots and your pants inside, and you throw your jacket up on the dash or the doghouse, and there it sits until you need to wear it. You turn on the air conditioner, starts throwing all that dust around, more inadvertent ingestion. So you need to make sure that you keep the gear as clean as possible and out of the apparatus compartment of the cab as much as possible. When you need to clean either a PPE room or an apparatus, don't use a leaf blower, don't use an air hose, because all you're doing is kicking all of that potentially PFAS contaminated dust in the air, and now you're breathing it into your respiratory system. So you want to either wet the floor down with water and squeegee it out, or use a pressure washer. If you're cleaning out the apparatus, wet down the surface and then wipe it down, all times making sure you're wearing a safety gloves and also an N95 mask to protect yourself against any respiratory exposures. So a lot of the times we've been talking about this finish on outer shells. But I would like to bring up one particular situation where there's one manufacturer that's out there that also uses this fluorinated finish, not only on the outer shells that they offer, but they also have it on their liners, the thermal liners. And this is done as part of their moisture management system, that having that fluorinated finish on the thermal liner prevents that thermal liner from soaking up water or sweat, as their sales pitch goes. Now again, fluorinated finishes were stopped being used 2014, 2015. So if you have one of these moisture management systems from this one particular company, you will have that gear and be wearing it till at least 2024 or 2025, if your department does retire it at the mandated NFPA of 10 years. And that's what's considered the legacy gear. Although they are using the C8 free fluorine finish now on the outer shells, but it's still on the thermal liner, and it's the C6 chemical, but it still is a PFAS chemical. Now, some people are saying that the polymers, the PFAS polymers, are the size of a volleyball, and those volleyballs are too big to actually enter your body and enter into your bloodstream. Now, on the surface, that is true, but what we're dealing with is the either UV or chemical degradation of those finishes, either on your thermal liner or on your outer shells, degrade, and they fall off. And those C6 have side chain polymers that do break off into smaller pieces that can enter your body. And this can be all confirmed through studies that are out there and some research that Graham Peasley from Notre Dame has done. So don't always believe what the industry is telling you about the volleyball terminology of the polymers. There's some companies out there that are touting the OCATEC standard. It's a European standard that certifies fabrics don't contain a particular PFAS. Well, the problem is from my understanding, the OCATEC standard only focuses on the old C8, which we acknowledge is not being used anymore. They do not test the C6 PFAS or the C4 compound. Okay, so just because someone says our fabric meets the OCATEC standard, it doesn't necessarily mean anything to us today because C8 isn't used. And they only test brand new fabric. So when I ask the questions of, well, what about after 5 washes or 5 months of usage? Can you confirm that that fabric is still PFOA free? That side chain polymer that wasn't there before is now there. We're only concerned with new, unused fabric. So in a short while of time, you now have PFOA back on the gear through those polymers that are breaking off and forming the side chain polymers. So like Sean was saying, I've been in constant conversations with manufacturers, fabric manufacturers and mills. And there's one particular manufacturer that's out there that they do have a fully certified composite to NFPA and UL. And that's a company called Safety Components, and it's their PF0 outer shell or PF0 finish. Whether it's the fluorine free or the fluorinated, the actual base fabric is identical. It's no different. They just choose to put a fluorinated finish or a non-fluorinated finish. And they've been, testing that stuff. And you got to remember, fluorinated finishes have been around for decades. So they know what's going to happen, how good it is, and it is really good. It keeps everything out, almost everything out of the fabrics. So now they're trying to get a product that will work just as good without all those harmful PFAS chemicals in it. So I'm presuming that they're trying to do all their research and ask as many questions and put that fabric through as many scenarios as possible that could come up on a fire call or vehicle accidents or chemical spills, and then test those theories out to see how well their fluorine-free finishes do. I mean, that's what I would do if I was in the manufacturing business. You got to ask all the questions so you know all the answers. From my understanding, the hope is that this fabric will be available from safety components, and also the manufacturer that actually cut and sew the gear will be available sometime in the first quarter of 2021. Now that sounds like a long way away, but you know, we've waited all these years now. At least we're getting somewhere. Some manufacturers, some mills don't think that the market is asking for this product yet, a fluorine-free product. Not the people that I've talked to. A lot of people want it. And then one last thing I'll go over. If you want to understand what PFAS is and what it can do to a person's health, then I suggest you go look at two videos that are available on Netflix or Amazon Prime. The first one is a documentary that was put out in 2018. It's called The Devil We Know. It's a documentary about the DuPont plant in the Parkersburg, West Virginia, water source contamination back for many decades, and the outcome of that. The attorney that took on DuPont and for lack of a better term, sued the crap out of him and won. They made a movie about him also. That came out in 2019, and that's called Dark Waters. That was produced by a company called Participant Media. Very, very good movie, and the documentary is very good also. So if you want to learn about how bad this PFAS is, watch those two, and it'll open your eyes up to what this chemical can do. So that's my 5-minute spiel.
Great, thanks, Jeff. We do have a few questions for both of you, and just a reminder to folks who are watching us that if you do want to ask a question for Sean or Jeff, you can just put it in the comment box. One of the questions, I think would be great to hear both of you what your take is just a question about how do I find out if our new generation PPE does not pose such an exposure risk? And I think it's a sort of a question about just understanding what are the risks of the newer generation gear I may have already bought. How do I investigate that question? I know Sean and Jeff, you've both tried to figure this out yourselves through your own conversations. Can maybe help some of our viewers kind of understand how they can try to answer that question. Sean, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I would say that the first thing you should do is do what I've been doing and what Jeff does, is call the textile companies, call the gear manufacturers, and ask them these questions. But in order to know what questions to ask, you're going to have to do some research. And so watching those videos those movies that Jeff mentioned is a good start. It'll give you a basis for what we're talking about. And then, you know, I think when this is over, we'll put some comments in the Facebook feed with some starting points and some documents that I've used here to begin my research, because I've been doing this now for about 8 months, and I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface. And so it's unreasonable to think that, you know, firefighters around the country are going to have the time or the ability to sit down and research this as deeply as they may have to figure out the answers. So things like that can help them along the way. But then make those phone calls and see what they say. And like I said earlier, don't just take what they say at face value. We have to continue to do research and see what they're basing it on.
Yeah, and then on top of that, I would just say there's no fluorine-free finish PPE right now. It's not available. They're still working on it. So all you have to do now is ask yourself, do I need to wear this gear? Yes or no? Right? Is a situation that I'm going into warrant me wearing this gear? If you do, then during and after, you need to just make sure you have safe handling practices and good hygiene after handling that gear.
one thing I will also just quickly mention is that Congress is considering a provision of a bill that would accelerate some government studies of PPE-free alternatives that would ask the National Institute for Standards and Technology and NIOSH to begin to study and ultimately certify PPE-free gear. So that's just something to keep an eye on. And Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire has been championing that in the Senate, and two members of the House, Congressman Dan Kildee and Congressman Perlmutter, Congressman Kildee from Michigan and Congressman Perlmutter from Colorado, have been championing those proposals. Another question we're getting, and this might be one for you, Jeff, is just help us understand a little bit more about how PFAS and the side chain polymers might be absorbed through the skin. How much ultimately gets through the skin?
Great question. And there are studies that are going on as we speak. So you can get, whether it's skin absorption or inhalation, they just don't know. And most of the studies that are out there, like Sean said, are studied by DuPont or Chemours or any associated companies to one of those two. So you have to take those studies with a grain of salt. You need a fully independent, not associated at all with a chemical company of any kind or a sponsorship to do that study from any one of those chemical companies, and it's tough. And I believe that they are doing some tests right now on that skin absorption on lab rats.
And we did post some studies on the comments box that have been done that have looked at other forms of skin absorption through other uses of PFAS that might be interesting to some of the viewers. I think I know the answer to this one, but I think we've gotten a couple of questions about whether Nomex uses PFAS, which I believe is being used by the Forest Service to fight fires in California right now. Jeff, what's the answer to that?
So if a particular fabric is certified to the 1971, or I believe it's the 1951, which is Tech Rescue, those garments, those NFPA guides have a water absorption requirement. If they have that requirement, then there's going to be a finish on there to prevent the water or reduce the water from being absorbed. So if a particular fabric most likely is only certified to 1977, which is a standard for wildland gear, they don't have that water absorption testing requirement. Therefore, there would not need to be a finish on it. However, in some cases, an outer shell material that is certified to 1971 is actually used in a 1977 wildland certified garment. They're not going to make two different finishes for that same fabric. So you now have like a 7-ounce Nomex or 7.5-ounce Nomex that's made to the structural standard that is used in a yellow color or a green color for forest surface that will most likely have the finish on it. And a good way that you can tell is if you take your garment and you take a bottle of water and you just spritz some water on it, if it beads up like mercury, there's most likely a finish on it. We have in our department, we have some newer wildland pants that are certified to only 77. You pour the water on it, within a few seconds, it's soaked right through, like you're draining water out of a funnel. No finish. So that's a good way to see if it's on there. You'll be amazed. I've put water on some outer shells and I've left it there for 48 hours, probably a half a tablespoon or so. 48 hours, there is no absorption. Take that, shake it right off. It's as dry as when I started.
We've got time for one more question. And Sean, we've gotten a couple of Nantucket specific questions. Just wondering about the question of water contamination on the island from the airport, and just a little bit more background on why your city council or county council so quickly decided that to pay for replacing turnout gear, and a little bit more background on that would be helpful.
Sure. So the second part, I'm not sure I can answer, but I think, you know, if you've done some research into PFAS and you understand how bad it can be and the exposure risk, and that there's so much unknown still about it, I think when we made a presentation to them, they understood, and so they made that move pretty quickly. And we commend them for that, because you know that's not happening anywhere else that I know of, and it should. So commend them for acting quickly and seeing what we saw. As far as the water contamination, we do have an airport here, and it was recently discovered, just like airports and military bases around the world, that there is some groundwater contamination around the airport. So that it's concerning, as it is for everybody. It's concerning for me because I'm a resident here and I live near the airport, and my water comes from a well. So I'm concerned about that. But as a firefighter, I'm also very concerned about our colleagues at the airport fire department, because they've worked for decades being told that AFFF, or this Class B foam, is as safe as soap. And so just like everywhere else, it was treated as soap because that's what they were told. And so now they find out that it's not. And, you know, people are getting sick, and there's probably a link there. And so to add to that, maybe the only thing that was keeping that AFFF from being absorbed or taking it home with them was their turnout gear. And now we're finding out that turnout gear also contains PFAS chemicals, and nobody was told about that either. So that's really the most concerning part for me.
Well, thank you, both of you, Sean and Jeff, for joining us, and thanks for all of our viewers joining us. And definitely check out the comments bar. We'll make sure to post some of the studies that Jeff and Sean have talked about if you're looking for more information. Have a great day.
Thank you.